Welcome to all PCU members. I would like to dedicate this lesson to my old friend Pal Benko, who is known as an American-Hungarian who started his chess career in Hungary and achieved most of his world-famous successes representing the United States, and spent most of his life in between his native country and his adopted country. However, only few people know that actually he was born in France. Well, besides this kind of historical tidbit, I'd like to talk about the subject of blockade. Remember, in our previous lesson, number 22, we were discussing about passed pawns and how dangerous they can be. In this lesson, we'll talk about what to do about it. Well, blockading a passed pawn, or in some cases, just blockading a pawn to restrict its mobility in general, can be very, very powerful. And I would like to demonstrate this through a game of Pal Benko against an American chess icon, Samuel Reshevsky. They played this game in the 1968 US Championship. Here we go. The game started with d4, knight f6, c4, c5. As you know, Grandmaster Benko is very famous for inventing the Benko gambit, which would start with d5 and then b5. But in this game, he did not want to face his own opening, and rather, as he put it in his book, he prefers to swim the English Channel, referring to transposing to the English opening and the symmetrical variation of it. In this position, there is an interesting gambit possibility for black, which became quite popular in the late 70s, where black would immediately try to gain good control of the center by playing e5, and after white's most ambitious response, knight b5, black would sacrifice a pawn for active play by playing d5, pawn takes, and now, of course, black cannot and should not take the pawn back because of an immediate tactic of queen d5 followed by the fork with knight c7. However, black would just play bishop to c5, and this is one of those long-term pawn sacrifices where black gets activity and some advantage in development for the pawn. However, this is a gambit, and there is a strong chance that it will be many, many moves, if ever, that you'll win the pawn back. So you need to have that mindset that you don't have a problem playing without a pawn. Let's go back to the game, because in this game Reshevsky did not go for that gambit. Also remember that this game has been played in the late 1960s, so prior to the time when this gambit was discovered by some Russian players. Reshevsky continued with a very standard move for this position, developing with knight c6, and Benko developed his knight by playing knight c3. Endgame e6. Well, this is an interesting moment in the game. White played in a positional way by playing g3, trying to develop the bishop to fianchetto to g2. There is an interesting attempt to play more aggressively by playing knight b5, with the idea to then give a check on d6. Then black pretty much has to play d5. And now, of course, there are no knight d6 at all. But white can play bishop f4, creating a threat of a fork with knight c7, which black can stop by playing e5. And now white can transpose to an interesting endgame after pawn takes on c6, pawn takes back, and queen takes, and king takes. And this has occurred many, many times in praxis. And, well, the evaluation currently is about even though Black has a clearly inferior pawn structure by having double pawns on the f-file and isolated pawns on the queen side, but as compensation they have the pair of bishops. Let's go back to the position after e6, where, as I mentioned, white could play knight d2 b5 and transpose to that endgame, or the more common move would be to play g3. After g3, black has several responses. Two of them are to develop the bishop, the dark squared bishop, either to b4 or to c5, which are of course well playable, or the sharpest of them all, to play queen to b6. Typically, we don't recommend to get the queen into the game at such an early stage of the game, but here black has specific ideas. For example, if the knight would retreat to c2, in that case, black would be doing quite fine after bishop c5 and immediately targeting white's weakest square, weakest point on f2, and as you can see, black seems to have a clear lead in development. Also, the reason why black can play queen b6 in this position is because the natural bishop developing move to e3 would not work, because that would leave the pawn on b2 hanging. So white's best move and most common move here is to retreat the knight to b3. And now the game continued with bishop to b4. A perhaps better move is to first play knight e5, putting pressure on the c4 pawn and to provoke the white pawn's advancement to e4, which would protect, of course, the pawn, but also it would weaken a whole bunch of squares in white's position. And then bishop b4 would follow up, pinning the white knight, attacking the pawn on e4 indirectly, and white would typically respond with queen e2 with a very interesting and complicated game. But I don't want to spend too much more time on this opening phase, and black played bishop b4 right away, and white of course hurries up and continues development to get ready to castle as soon as possible. And black played d5, which is a pawn sacrifice. White captured. And now, if black captures with the pawn, black would be pretty much stuck with an isolated pawn that white can target after finishes development. In the game, Reshevsky took back with the knight. Now, if white would trade on d5, it's certainly a possibility, but it would weaken the light squares on the king side, and that could be a problem potentially after white castles to that side of the board. In addition to Benko's move in the game, which was castling, also bishop d2 looks quite a good choice. Okay, so let's move on with the game. White has castled, and now black has two choices to capture on c3. With the knight, which happened in the game, or with the bishop. If the bishop captures and then the knight, white would simply move the queen out of the way to d2, and then depending where the black knight goes, basically the idea is to play bishop to a3 and prevent black from castling. White would have more than enough compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Let's go back and see what happened after knight takes knight and pawn takes knight. And here Reshevsky did not dare to capture the pawn. In that case, Benko planned to just play bishop e3, followed by rook to c1 with a very active play, and white will have a very, very strong initiative. The bishop retreated to e7, and white now has to play energetically, because at the moment, white has a ruined pawn structure on the queen side. Having two isolated pawns on a2 and c3 are black's targets. So if black simply manages to castle and then solve the problem of the bishop on c8, black will be better. So that's why white plays rather energetically with bishop e3, attacking the queen. And black moved the queen out of the way. In fact, he offered a draw in this position, which white declined. And white played bishop c5. After bishop c5, if black would capture the bishop, knight would capture back. And after queen moves away, a very important move, queen d6, stopping black from castling. And if black would try to trade queens, after which castling wouldn't be that important anymore, then a very important move, not just to retreat the queen, which would allow black to castle, but to play knight e4, a very tricky move. Black still cannot castle because the king is busy guarding the knight on e7, and after trade on d6, white would recapture with a fork and then winning the pawn on b7. Let's go back some moves again, all the way to this position. So black retreated the bishop to e7, white played bishop to e3 as we said, the queen moved to a6, and the white bishop just came to c5. And black castled. At first it seems that now white can take the knight on c6 and then the bishop on e7, but actually black can escape here by playing bishop to c5 and only then capturing the second bishop on c6. However, Benko's plan was, who is an endgame magician, to play queen d3 and basically offer the trade of queens under very favorable conditions. Of course, the threat is now very strong, trading the queens on a6 and then grabbing the knight on c6. So black traded queens himself. Pawn captured back and came rook to d8. And finally, we are getting to our whole subject of blockade. White traded on c6, forcing black to first trade on c5, and here we are. Now we see the blockade, the white knight sitting on c5. And the whole idea of this is to paralyze the black bishop on c8. As you can see, the bishop cannot get out on a6, it cannot get out on e6 through e6 because the pawn is there. So this is a very important and key moment, and now white has to make a preventive move, making sure that bishop does not get developed. And that key move is to play f4. As you can see in chess, preventive moves, preventing your opponent's plans, can be equally important to creating your own threats or plans. And basically, this position is quite hopeless for black already. Let's see how the fight continued. Black took control for a moment of the only open file, and of course, white doesn't wait much longer either and balances that, and came rook to b5, attacking the knight on c5, and came d4, protecting the knight. Black brought the king towards the middle of the board, and now white simply improves the position little by little. King f2. Black played bishop d7. Of course, this is one of those situations where you certainly do not want to trade your knight for the bishop. Unlike in most opening or middle game positions, when you have a choice to trade a knight for a bishop, you would want to go for it. This is not one of those cases because you clearly have a good knight versus bad bishop situation. So now white's goal is to try to gain control of the b file or to connect the queenside pawns and get rid of an isolated pawn on a2. Came rook b3, black played king to e7 and c4. So this is an attempt to either chase the rook away from the b file or invite a trade on b3, when white would be very happy taking back with the pawn from a2 and then open the a file, and then the white rook from f1 could come to a1 and target the pawn on a7. Black is trying to avoid this from happening as long as they can and played rook to b6, and now white doubled up the rooks, putting more pressure on that rook. Black still protected the rook, trying to invite the same, trying to offer white to trade on b6, which would of course benefit black for the same reasons, because the black pawn from a7 would connect with the isolated pawn on c6, and the black rook would potentially have the opportunity to go to a8 and target white's isolated pawn on a2. But it's white who achieves the goal at the end of the day, namely by playing knight a4, attacking the rook, and now finally black has no choice if they want to avoid material loss but to give in and trade. And now, of course, white needs the rook to attack the pawn on a7, so therefore does not take back with the rook, but wants to keep the rooks on the board and plays pawn take rook. And now white simply needs to optimize the position of all his pieces, knight c5 and rook to a1. Black played a6, a tricky move. In case white would capture the pawn on a6, the knight would step into a pin, and after rook a8, white would regret taking the pawn. So the rook at the moment went to a3, protecting the pawn on b3, which will free up the white knight. Came rook to a8 and king e3. Black's problem is that there is no counterplay whatsoever. Black is just purely on the waiting and on the defensive. Knight e4 with a sneaky threat of playing knight g5, which would fork two of the black pawns on f7 and h7. And black prevented that move by playing h6. And now white played c5, creating an outpost for the knight on d6. As you can see, the poor black bishop is really miserable, and white can take his time to optimize the position of all his pieces. As so often in such type of situations, the stronger side is maneuvering a bit and a little bit going on the opponent's nerves, because it's pretty unpleasant to defend such positions. So at times, the stronger side doesn't necessarily disclose immediately the most dangerous plan, but first maneuvers a little bit to kind of try to make the opponent fall asleep and lose the alertness. And that's what we see here happening a little bit. Black played f5, which is a bit inferior than just playing f6, which could give at least a hope to one day play e5. And now the knight went back to c4, bishop to e8, and knight b6. Rook has to go to a7, and now rook a1, just kind of giving the idea that maybe the rook wants to show up on e1, attacking the pawn on e6, but not really. White is just kind of, I think, trying to make the time control. In those days, typically, you would have to make 40 moves in 2 hours or 40 moves in 2.5 hours. And this is move 37, so I think it has to do with the time shortage probably on Benko's side. Came b4, bishop back to e8, king d2, and bishop h5, h3, king d8. And after knight c4, the game was adjourned. Remember those days? Games could be adjourned also, which meant that games didn't have to be finished in one sitting, but after 40 or sometimes 60 move, you would stop the game and continue it on another day. So this was one of those moments. And the game continued with the bishop retreating to e8, and rook came to e3. Of course, nowadays, adjourned games are history. Since the appearance of chess software, chess computers, it would be really not very interesting to see playing out adjourned games anymore, because it would be all computer analysis. Rook came to e7, and white made one more repetition of moves and a little bit more maneuvering until finally white goes on the right plan. King d8, and the king is finally moving towards the queen side. King c7 and king b3. So the white king can appear on a5, and that's the game plan. And then the white rook can go to e1, and then the knight can jump around and either go and attack the e6 pawn or get to d6, depending how black is reacting. Black is purely on the waiting mode. Knight c4, bishop h5, and rook e1, going after the pawn. Now, if rook would go to e8, then tactics would show up immediately. And after knight rook e7, protecting the pawn, knight f5, using the pin. So going back, black protected the pawn actually with the bishop. And king a4. So now the plan is to get the king to a5, get the knight to d6, and then play g4 and break through. I suggest, if you feel like, you may want to take this position against one of the software programs such as Fritz or Junior or any other, and try to see if, knowing what the plan should be, you're able to close out this position and you can win it against Fritz. If you can win it against Fritz, it probably means you could win it against any grandmaster as well. So it's an excellent practice. And here black kind of lost his patience a little bit and didn't want to just wait passively, but played e5, which maybe speeds up the end even further. If white would now take with the knight, which is, by the way, all of a sudden hanging, then bishop d5 at least would give black some hope, because the pawn on d4, the extra pawn that white has, would be blockaded and would give black some counter chances to save the game. But much stronger was to play knight b6, an intermediate move attacking black's rook, and then capture with the rook. Now black's problem is that the pawn on f5 is hanging, as well as white is threatening to trade rooks. Black traded, and white created a protected passed pawn. Now the win is rather easy. White is just bringing the king back to where the action is now. And then the knight needs to get regrouped to d4 to chase out the blockading piece of the white pawn. Of course, as we know, the best blockading pieces are the knights, not the bishops. Came knight a4, g6, knight c3, bishop c4, knight d1, bishop f1, h4. Again, black has no target, no counterplay. And after knight c2, black actually resigned. The knight will appear on d4, and then the e-pawn can just march up. Well, a very instructive game, and especially the stage where white transposed to that clearly superior position with the knight versus bishop and the 4 rooks on the board, and how white made sure that the black bishop will not get out. And all thanks to the blockade that the white knight achieved on c5. A very nice example. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. As I mentioned in my introduction, Pal Benko is not only a great chess player, but he's also one of the best composers of all times. He can compose incredibly difficult and beautiful endgames and entertain all chess players. Well, this is one of his easy endgames. Well, in this position, white is up 3 pawns, and yet there are serious challenges to win the game. And the challenge all is in avoiding the stalemate. For example, if pawn takes rook right now, the game is immediately a stalemate. If white would not capture the rook, but would move the rook back to h2 and consolidate the pawn on f2, black again could force a different stalemate by playing rook h7. And pawn takes rook, again stalemate. So what should white do to win the game? Try to think and then come back and check if your solution was correct. And the answer is g7. If the rook takes the pawn, white just plays f4, and 2 pawns are just quite enough to win the game easily. So therefore, that would be easy. So the black king should go out to g8. Now again the challenge is that if white plays king g6, black could just play rook f6, forcing another pretty stalemate. Also, if the white rook would retreat again to h2, black would be able to play rook takes f2 and again escape thanks to the stalemate. And now here comes the correct solution. The rook moves to h3. If here the black rook immediately takes the pawn, the white rook swings over to the queen side, threatening with rook a8 and then promoting the pawn. And the black rook cannot come back to the 8th rank because the g7 pawn guards the f8 square. Also, after the rook check and king g6, we'll go back to our main line. Let's see if black plays here rook to f3, which will result transposed to the same variation we saw. Black again is trying to make a draw. So rook g3, putting the rook on a protected square, rook f2, and now rook a3. So now we're back in that same position. Rook h2, king g6. And now rook h6, of course, is not good because the king can take and release freedom to the black king to escape on f7. So the better try is to play rather rook a2. And this looks dangerous because now if rook takes rook, it's stalemate. If rook b3, rook b2. How can white escape from this constant chase? Well, the answer is the rook needs to go to f3, threatening checkmate on the back rank. In fact, if rook c8, white would immediately play rook f8 and transpose to an easily winning pawn endgame. And after rook c6 check, rook takes, of course not pawn, but king takes, releasing the h7 square for the black king. And then nothing else but pawn promotion, and then we created an easily winning pawn endgame by opposition. On the other hand, if we move back to the moment when black keeps chasing and rook f3, rook c8, rook f6, and rook goes back to c8, then again rook f8 leads to an easily winning pawn endgame. Well, a very cute endgame. Hope you enjoyed it, as well as learned from Benko's game against Rashevsky and learned about the blockade and good knight versus bad bishop. Thank you for listening. Until next week. Bye-bye.